Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Speedy, the librarian of the Cory Library, Rhodes University, will now address us on the subject of Africana, which she is going to link up with the history of the border and the history of the 1820 settlers as far as she is able. Miss Speedy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for asking me to come and talk to you tonight. I don't feel that you've necessarily got the right person to talk to you, but nevertheless, one is always flattered when asked to speak. Although I feel we might have had a more exciting evening had I talked to you about the Africana Enthusiast as depicted by the Daily Dispatch. When I first read that, I must admit I didn't think of animals in the terms of Africana. I thought perhaps you wanted an insight into the love life of a librarian or something like that, which might have been amusing enough, but possibly not quite what is wanted by a historical society. The thing that I'm going to talk to you tonight about is the Africana Enthusiast, and that's the man who is interested in Africana, and that particularly relating to the Eastern Province. And here I must explain, I have divided the Cape Province into three areas. The Northern Cape, which is way over to the other side of us, and the Western Cape, which starts somewhere around George or Knysna, somewhere thereabouts, and the rest of it going right up to the Natal border, I refer to as the Eastern Cape. Now, this is perhaps a little bit sad for you who consider yourself as part of the border, but it's the easier way that I have taken out. And in talking about the Africana Enthusiast, one can mention quite a number of different kinds of enthusiast. There is, to start off with, the man who collects Africana. Now, I suppose the ideal book for you to read, if you're interested in collecting Africana, is this publication of 1963 by Dennis Godfrey, and it's called The Enchanted Door. And he, as you might know if you read the Sunday Chronicle, and if you don't read the Sunday Chronicle, I would seriously recommend it to you, because it's quite one of the best newspapers that South Africa has produced. And it's particularly good on Africana, on recent novels, recent publications of any kind, entertainment, art, the theatre, and that kind of thing. Well, if you haven't read Dennis Godfrey's columns in the Sunday Chronicle, I would suggest that you read his book. And he talks about many of the different Africana enthusiasts, the collectors in this country, and one of the men that he refers to is Mr. James Humphreys. Now, Mr. James Humphreys is a man that visits the Cory Library at infrequent intervals. It's a man we always enjoy seeing very much, despite his gold mines, and I think he owns about 12 of them. The interest to East London is, in particular, that his father was concerned with the building of the railway from East London to Queenstown, and he was involved in the various frontier wars. And Mr. Humphreys has a very general collection in Africana, but he has tried to collect Africana relating to the history of mining in South Africa in particular. And he has found that this is a field about which quite a lot has been written, but most of what has been written has been in the form of newspaper articles, and most of these newspapers of the mining towns of last century are no longer in existence. And that brings him up to the very general plea which I would like to endorse, and that is that we should make our very best attempt to collect old newspapers, to collect letters, diaries, and anything that is relative to the history of our country. So many of us have relations who have collected a whole lot of paper, and after they've died, the easiest way to deal with this is to burn it. But to the Africana specialist, this is about the biggest crime that you could commit. And I wish that those sort of people would have a most uncomfortable life at the least for burning all these very valuable things. One feels horrible things about them, but I don't think I'd better say quite what I feel about them, particularly as this is going on tape. And I'm going to be quoted in future saying that I feel that the people who destroy Africana should have a sticky end. The thing nowadays, I think, in collecting Africana, if this is going to be your interest, is to take a specialist field. Decide on something like Dr. Denfield has the photographs relative to East London in particular and early Cape photography in general. You might choose some other aspect of East London history. And I hope very much that the Border Historical Society in the future is going to produce a history of East London, because this is a very real need that we have. We have histories of Grahamstown, we have histories of Port Elizabeth, Janssenville, Craddock, Queenstown, and all sorts of towns in the Eastern Cape, but we don't seem to have anything on East London. But the only thing we have is the history that was produced at the time of the centenary of the city, and while that's a very useful introduction, it is only about 10 pages, and that is not nearly sufficient for a city that has played such an important role in South Africa. For the collector, of course, first editions, rare editions, and things of this kind are particularly important. But for the historian, it doesn't really matter whether it's a first edition or a 50th edition, as long as it is an edition that he's got at his fingertips and can use and can learn something from relative to the subject he's interested in. And it's very much the same way for the librarian. And I thought you might like me to mention some of the tools that would be useful to anybody who is either a librarian or an Africana research worker. And of course, the first thing that springs to mind is the two fat volumes of Mendelssohn's bibliography. And you'll notice in the straight reproductions, reprints that he's bringing out at regular intervals, that in nearly all these reprints, he quotes the Mendelssohn opinion of the work that he's reproducing again. Other books which of course are very useful but one can't possibly afford to buy are things like the British Museum catalogue, the Library of Congress catalogue, and current bibliographies of the kind of the CBI and the BNB. CBI's Cumulative Book Index, and the BNB is the British National Bibliography. These are words that one always uses the abbreviation for, and one tends to forget what they stand for. The Library of Congress catalogue is particularly useful because the Library of Congress never catalogues a book under the pseudonym. It always catalogues it under the real name. So if you've got a novel about this part of the world by Francis Bancroft, maybe The Settler's Eldest Daughter, something like this, you go to the Library of Congress catalogue, and hopefully it will tell you that it's Frances Charlotte Slater who wrote the book and not Francis Bancroft. Actually, in point of fact, it doesn't tell you that because they don't know about it, because I looked that up before I came. But this is the general idea. We also had a most embarrassing experience in the Cory Library. We had a book by Limner, and it was catalogued. It was the pen and ink sketches, which is very interesting because it was written about, say, 100 years ago, and has most caustic comments to make about the various members of Parliament. And if he didn't like them, he made no bones about it. Well, one of my predecessors thought Limner, no, that's not the man's real name, looked up in the Library of Congress and came across John Layton with the dates of his birth and death. And so this book was duly catalogued in the Cory Library under John Layton. And Cape Town University has just now published the index to pen and ink sketches, and has published them under Limner R.W. Murray. Very embarrassing for us. It's duly been put right. Other things that are very useful is a publication put out by the State Library in Cape Town, the South African Library, and that is Africana Nova. and that is a copyright list of all the new books printed in South Africa and about South Africa. And it's tremendously useful if you want to be sure that you've kept up to date on your subject. And the one booksellers catalogue, which is very useful, is the Strake catalogue. Strake is this big firm in Cape Town, and it produces both a catalogue of current books about South Africa, as well as a second-hand catalogue of old books. And that's very useful. Other sort of things that you want to get are bibliographies, and the Library School in Cape Town produces the most bibliographies. The Johannesburg Public Library produces quite a number, as well as indexes. And if any of you are going to write a history, and I hope that many of you will, please put in a bibliography and an index. Your history is useless without an index. One of the recent books that have been published, for which an index was very much in demand, is Phillips' 1820 Settler, edited by Professor Keppel-Jones and Miss Heathcote. And the Johannesburg Public Library has now produced a separate index. But it should have had an index at the time of publication. The one big blessing, or there are two big blessings obviously, but the one added blessing about the Strake reprints is that he always adds an index, and so you can find your way around the volume when you want to. I don't think I'll spend much time in talking about publications such as Africana Notes and News and the Quarterly Bulletin of South African Libraries. These contain very interesting articles of historical interest, and for the Africana collector are very important too. And I would like to add things like your Sheila Camp, the Port Elizabeth Historical Society's Looking Back, and once again I would commend to you the Sunday Chronicle. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the different kinds of Africana, and I want to start at the back, if I can put it that way, some of the, in effect, least important or least likely ones, and then work up towards the books. And the one that I'd like to start with is the availability now of a great deal of material on microfilm and microcards, and in fact in any kind of microform. This is particularly important, although it's a beastly way to have to read anything, and it gives you eye strain and it puts your temper out of joint, but nevertheless it is one way of getting hold of material which you would not otherwise be able to appreciate, to read and to enjoy. And the thing that probably most historians turn to first is the microfilm of various old newspapers, and I think in particular the microfilm of the Grahamstown Journal. If of course you both like Cape Town and you have the means to get to Cape Town, you can look these papers up in reality in the South African Library, or you can do the same thing at the Cory Library at Rhodes, because we have an almost complete set of the Grahamstown Journal. But Cape Town has a more complete set of many more newspapers than we have back there. The second form is one that was very dear to Dr. Denfield's heart, so I'm sure it's one that you will all know about, and that is Africana in a pictorial form, whether it's an old illustration or a photograph or a reproduction of any of these things. It's all tremendously important. And I'd like to illustrate the importance of having pictures or reproductions of particular people who played an important part in the history by quoting from English history and quoting a detective story at that. And I would commend to you the story by Josephine Tay called Daughter of Time. In this she depicts a detective inspector, I think, of New Scotland Yard who did something silly like falling down a drain and breaking his legs or something odd anyway, and he was immobilized in bed. And one of his friends produced for him a whole stack of photographs of historical characters who had some kind of mystery attached to them. And he picked out the photograph of Richard III, who you all know as Richard Hunchback or Crookback, and you know he was a nasty man who murdered his 2 little nephews and swiped the throne of England, and there he was, but he got his just deserts at the Battle of Bosworth, and he was duly killed off, and everybody said, yay for that. Well, Josephine Tay proceeds to take you through a kind of detective investigation from the bedside, in which she shows that this man looked at the photograph of Richard, a photograph of a portrait of Richard III, and said, he looks like a judge, he looks like a man who suffered greatly, but he looks like a very admirable and entirely nice sort of person. And she set out to prove that he hadn't done any of these nasty things, he hadn't murdered his nephews, he hadn't deserved to be killed at Bosworth, and this, that, and the next thing, and it was all part of the myth that the Tudor successor to Richard III had to spin, because he had no right whatsoever to the throne, because he'd just taken the throne and that was it, so he had to justify himself one way and another. The other form that Africana takes that I wanted to discuss with you is that of the old newspaper. Now, I could talk to you about the old Daily Dispatch, or the old Grahamstown Journal, or perhaps the fight for the freedom of the press down in Cape Town in 1826, but these are things that I think you know about. I wanted to talk to you about a newspaper with a very small circulation, with a subscription of ½ a crown a year, which the editors were very glad to receive right at the beginning of the year, because they were 2 young boys, one aged 14 and the other was 16 months older, and they had a weekly income of 3d each, that was their pocket money, and anything that they could sell from their garden, because they were farmers' sons, went towards any other outside activity that they wanted to indulge in. And these 2 boys in 1870 decided that they were going to print a newspaper. The one boy had already been publishing a handwritten newspaper called the Serio Comic, and he wasn't satisfied with this, so he started publishing the Kariga News. His farm was in the Kariga Valley, and that's his father's farm, I should say, and that's how it got its name. And the Kariga News had a very interesting life, I think. He and his brother, somehow or the other, had managed to save up whole 5 shillings, and with this 5 shillings they went into Grahamstown, and they went to meet Mr. Sheffield, Tom Sheffield, who owned the Grahamstown Advertiser, which afterwards became the Eastern Star, which afterwards became the Johannesburg Star, and they bought from him a fount of type for 5 shillings. And they set to make their own press, because they didn't have any more money. They found the back of a grate, which was a nice solid piece of steel or cast iron or something, and a leaf from a mahogany table, and then they found that other things they'd needed were compositor sticks and all the rest of it. I don't know much about that jargon. And they also needed ink, so they consulted an encyclopedia and found a recipe for ink, so proceeded to make their ink. They needed paper, and of course they couldn't afford to buy a newsprint, so fortunately they found an old roll of sealing paper in the attic, and they used that. And then they would set to, and they would set up the type for 1 page, and if when they got towards the end of the page in their news item they found that they were running short of a particular letter, well, they just had to change their actual wording so that they could fill the page up. And they produced this newspaper. The first edition was volume 2, number 17, because it was a continuation of the old Serio Comic. And I've got some copies here of the old newspaper. It's very small, as you might see, and this is quite a late edition of it, because it's got lines in it. This they were able to do afterwards because of the subscriptions that they had got in. And they managed at one stage to persuade the Grahamstown Advertiser to put a subscription in, and they persuaded the Grahamstown Advertiser to give them, at least to put an advertisement in, and the Grahamstown Advertiser gave them the print so that they could have a nice fancy-looking advertisement as well. And then the father of the boy was in correspondence with a man who was engaged in the Franco-Prussian War, and so they were able to put in real live news about the Franco-Prussian War, which nobody else knew from the letters that their father had received. There's a very interesting article, at least chapter, in the biography of the man who started this newspaper, and it's called the Caricha News, and the man who started it was W.H. Somerset Bell. And I could read you quite a bit of it, but it would take some time, and my reading voice isn't particularly good. But you would be interested to know that when the Caricha News no longer was published, the type, font, and all that kind of thing was sold to Mr. Dewey in Alice, and he used it for his newspaper. And so it had a very worthy and venerable history. While on the subject of Bell, this is completely off the topic, of course, his daughter, May Bell, has just published, or had a book posthumously published on the 1820 settlers called They Came from a Far Land. And of all the books that I've read on the 1820 settlers, this is by far the best, the most interesting, and it brings all the characters to life. So I would recommend that to you if you haven't already read it. It's really fantastic how she manages to have William Shaw, and John Ailiff, and Thomas Phillips, and Georgie Wood, and Jane Hoole, and the whole lot of them all living at the same time, and she's quoted from their letters and diaries and things of this kind, and it's all authentic biography, and it's very exciting reading. And I'm not an 1820 settler fan, I might say, so it's quite a concession for me to even recommend a book about them, except in the course of duty when I have to do something like that. There was an interesting article in a recent Sunday Chronicle about a man in Johannesburg, a young boy, who also had produced a Sunday Chronicle about in the 1930s, but his wasn't a printed one, his was a manuscript one. From printed matter we get on to manuscripts. Manuscripts really, I suppose, consist of the letters, the diaries, and the journals written by people at various times. And I suppose to that lot we can add accounts. Accounts are terribly important because they give you an idea of the cost of living at a time and whether it was a prosperous time or not in which to live. Letters can be very exciting, can be very revealing about the people that one's interested in, and can turn up in the oddest places. One lot of letters that interested me very much was a lot found by Alan Hattersley, the Natal historian, when he was in north of Britain. And they were letters written by Lucy Gray. Lucy Gray was the daughter of a minister of the church, and she and her brother Samuel, who was also a minister of the church, came out to South Africa in round about the 1845, something like that. And she was in Wynberg and Cape Town for a while, and then passed through Port Elizabeth and Grahamstown, and her brother had his church in Craddock. So she has quite a lot to say about that. But when she got to Grahamstown, she wrote back to her father various things about it. For example, she said that there are a number of military stationed in Grahamstown. Being a small place, it seemed full of them. Mr. Heaviside, that was the Anglican minister, called on us, and finding we were to go early on Monday, asked us to dine at his house on Sunday. The church is very bad outside, but though not architectural inside, is very nice. Quite a large town church with a gaudy painted east window. The Heavisides are not an interesting family. He looks weak, she vulgar, and the younger ones, with one exception, wanting ordinary refinement of manners. And then she talks about Archdeacon Merriman. She says, I have not named the Archdeacon's children, 5 in number. They are fine, nice-mannered children, but nothing remarkable except a most winning little girl, 2 years old. And she carries on in very much that vein, and it's rather interesting to be able to read that, because you have Archdeacon Merriman's journals as published by the Van Riebeck Society and as published by the Grahamstown Diocese under the editorship of Mr. H.M. Matthews. And this is the kind of sidelight that one likes to read about the people that one's generally reading about. When it comes to diaries again, they turn up in the most fantastic manner. One that interested me very much, and one that I've been involved in a great deal, is the diary of an 1820 settler by the name of Thomas Schoen. Now, Thomas Schoen is the most interesting character. There's such a lot of controversial nonsense talked about his early life that I think he must have had a very good gift of the gab. He told each member of his family a different story about himself. The one he told that he had been the captain and part owner of a brigantine, and that he had been involved in the Napoleonic Wars. He had been captured by the French. He had been imprisoned for 12 years and released on condition that he fought for the French against the Austrians. And so he fought at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, I hope, and he had been captured again, and this time he had escaped with the help of his brethren amongst the French Freemasons, and then he had come back to England, and his mother had looked upon him and said, "You have disgraced the family name by fighting for the French. I don't want to see you ever again," and so he had become an 1820 settler. The second story goes that he was a midshipman in the British Navy. He was again captured by the French. He was again imprisoned for about 12 years. This time he was released on condition again that he fought for the French in the campaign to Russia in 1812. And so he was one of the few to survive the retreat from Moscow. And he returned to England, and he found that he was no longer regarded as a British national. He had lost his nationality because he had fought for the French, and so he departed for South Africa as an 1820 settler. The third story goes that he was a captain, he was a commissioned officer, actually they didn't say he was a captain, a commissioned officer who led the Scottish troops mounted on grey horses the Battle of Waterloo, and King George III was so impressed by what he had done that he decorated him there and there. George III, as you know, was at that stage mentally incapacitated, so it's hardly likely to have decorated him. The first story, of course, is very interesting in that had he been captain of the brigantine and imprisoned for 12 years and released and fought at the Battle of Austerlitz, he would have been captain of his said brigantine at the age of 9, which didn't seem very probable either. The documentary evidence shows that he was born in 1784, that he was resident in London in 1811 when he was described as a labourer, that he married in 1814, that he had a certain number of children, I can't remember quite how many because they were both sides of the blanket, and he emigrated with the 1820 settlers, and that's about all we know about him. But we fortunately managed to collect, I think 3 or 4 of his diaries, the first one from 1838 to 1839, and the second one from 1850 to 1867. He died in 1868. And the way these diaries came to light, nobody seemed to know about them, was as a result of the travelling exhibition that Tom Barry of the Albany Museum arranged for about the 1820 settlers. And one of dear Thomas, the 1820s great-great-grandsons, saw this exhibition and very proudly went up to Dr. Barry and said, "Do you happen to know all about Thomas, 1820 settler?" And Tom Barry said, "I'm afraid I don't. There are over 4,000 settlers and I just don't know anything about him." Well, this man was very incensed about this. He wrote and told me all about it and said that his family had presented to the Albany Museum the coat in which dear Thomas had got married. I can't believe that dear Thomas got married in this coat. I don't know where he got it from, but I don't believe anything about Thomas's early life. And he was very hurt that Tom Barry didn't know more about his ancestor and realized that he would have to do something about it. Also, one of Thomas's daughters married Jeremiah Goldswain. And in the Van Riebeck Society publication of Jeremiah Goldswain's Chronicle, it stated that which one was it? One of the Goldswains, anyway, married a Schoen, and with a question mark, and had 8 children. and he was able to tell me quite definitely that it was Sarah Shone that had married the Goldswain and that they had had 12 children. Or was it John Shone that married Sarah Goldswain? I can't remember the details now, I've got myself muddled up. But anyway, we have found out a tremendous amount about this man and about his family as a result of one member of the family becoming interested and writing to absolutely everybody that he possibly could write to. He wrote to two of his old uncles. Both I think have subsequently died, and he got all sorts of information from them. He's written to branches of the family in Britain and branches of the family in New Zealand. And only by showing this tremendous interest have these diaries come to light. And they're very important in that old Thomas was the kind of man who recorded everything that happened to him. He went across to so-and-so and collected the washing. He visited so-and-so who washed his shirts for him, and he washes my shirts very much better than the girls do. And today was a misty sort of day, so I didn't plant anything in the garden. And I made a pair of shoes for so-and-so at such and such a price. And you, by reading this, get something of the flavour of the times in which the man lived. And I would make a plea, which I know you'll all endorse, that we must take care of these old documents and make sure that they go to the proper authorities. I, of course, am very partisan. I would love them all to come to the Cory Library, but I know that East London has its own calls on material relative to East London, and you probably wouldn't be too happy to see them landed up at Rhodes, but we would be delighted to have them. From there, I suppose I should talk something about books and something about the reasons why people collect books. And books can be collected for all sorts of reasons, such as the fact that they're recent, they're about a subject that you're interested in, so therefore you buy them. Or maybe because they're old. There are a lot of people who just buy old books because they're old and they look good and they make you feel good to see them on the shelves. Of course, you never look inside them because you wouldn't understand them, or you wouldn't want to. You might collect these books because of the person who had owned them, because they have the signature of, say, John X. Merriman, or Cecil Rhodes, or Jannie Smuts, somebody like this. And they'd be of value to you just because of the signature. It doesn't matter what the subject itself is about. General association of that kind. They might be of interest to you because they were published in your town. It's amazing, this is particularly true of Grahamstown, but it's amazing the number of publishers that we had in Grahamstown. And you get the most queer old books which bear a Grahamstown imprint. And some of them are very exciting and perhaps the sort of thing that wouldn't be published today. One that I remember reading some years back with great interest was a book called Elvira. I don't know who it's by now, I'm afraid I can't remember. And it was about a ghostly ship that appears at Port Alfred. And it was very excitingly written. A man, I think he must have been a Spaniard or a Portuguese, and his galleon came sailing into Port Alfred Harbour, and of course there was this beautiful girl, and there was another nasty man who wanted to get hold of this beautiful girl, and they had a great big fat fight, and of course the right guy got the right girl in the end. But it's very exciting. One doesn't associate pirates and buccaneers and exciting people with Port Alfred. It's such a sleepy hollow. My grandmother can remember the day when Port Alfred was a bigger city than East London. But those were the days, those were. You might also be collecting your books for interest of the author. Now, for example, you might be particularly interested in the writings of Stuart Clutie, and so you will collect his books with great joy and enthusiasm. Personally, I think Stuart Clutie's books are quite unreadable. I've even tried reading his banned book, and I couldn't see any reason for banning it, and it wasn't even interesting for that, from that point of view. It's just plain boring as far as I'm concerned. Another group of people that you might, in South Africa, be particularly interested in, and those are the African writers, or the coloured people, both coloured African and Indian. There is a novel written by an Indian woman doctor, which came out about 1960, perhaps it was a little bit after that, to to commemorate the coming of the Indian people to South Africa, and it's called Behold the Earth Mourns. They're the books by the coloured author, Peter Abrams. Some of them are tremendously interesting, and they're interesting in their own right to see how the man's literary ability has improved as the years went by. I think he first published about 1948, and his books have changed tremendously since then. Of course, his most interesting book, Tell Freedom, is banned, but if you ever get out the country, I would suggest you read it, because it really is a very, very interesting story. It's his autobiography, and it's continued in Return to Goli. Another African writer, or an African writer, who I think is particularly good and who has given a great deal to literary standard, literary criticism, and literature in general, is a man with the most unpronounceable name. It's Ezekiel Mphahlele. I can never get it out. He was a school teacher in South Africa, and for political reasons he had to leave, and he's now a university lecturer in Nigeria, I think, and he's written some very interesting books. His autobiography, Down Second Avenue, is not banned as far as I know, but his great contribution to literature, The African Image, is banned. I suppose it's no good recommending to you banned books, because one can't get hold of them unless one is outside the country. Other African writers that one's most interested in would be people like Noni Jabavu. Noni Jabavu is the third generation of an African family from this part of the world who has had the benefit of an education of the kind that you and I have enjoyed. Her grandfather was John Tengu Jabavu, who founded the newspaper Imvo in King Williamstown. Her father was Professor DDT, Davidson Don Tengo Jabavu, and he was the first professor or first lecturer appointed to the South African Native College at Fort Hare. And Noni Jabavu has written 2 books in recent years, is living in England. I think she's married to an Englishman, I'm not certain about that, and she does quite a lot of journalistic work in England. Now, one can be interested in that family as a family to see what they have produced, and they've all written something, books, newspapers, something of this kind. You can again be interested in Noni Jabavu as a figure in the political struggle which the Africans have in this country. As far as the general African is concerned, I mean the politically conscious one, they haven't got a good word to say for Noni Jabavu, because they say that she has aligned herself with the capitalistic kind of powers. I'm putting this in the wrong kind of terminology, I know, but she has had a good life, she is having it good at the moment, and she is therefore no longer fighting for the African in this country and for his political rights. And because she is living her own kind of life, they don't admire her at all. I think while on the general subject of Africans, one might talk about the different points of view and aspects that you come across in books dealing with the history of this part of the world, but written at various times. Another man who writes very much along those lines is Malema, who was one of the first Africans to put his thoughts down on paper, and he also says that he finds very interesting things to say about the position of the African in the nation that we have at the moment. And one of the things that he is very sad about is that he feels that the African will never be able to get to the position that we would like him to have because of the pessimism, which is a direct outcome of the fear, distrust, suspicion inspired by the legislation of recent years. This was written in 1920. And all this kind of legislation was written because, at least was enacted because the white man feared that the African would take over from him. This, I think, is probably all that I want to say about books in general, and gives you some idea of the kind of thing that you can read if you're an Africana specialist. But I'm quite sure that you...
Anybody came down to Foster Texas, they knew they were going to have a talk on the Africana enthusiast with age. I was very interested to hear who the first person was, being really part of that, and the flag disappeared long ago. I was just wondering whether the minister put his £7 towards the foundation stone of our city hall. You also said you wondered whether you were the right person to talk to us. Well, I'm sure there's not a person here who hasn't hung on every word which you have said about your very, very broad subject. You started off by saying that, then you said you're not an 1820 enthusiast. Well, I think that is only because you are so close to it. You are an historian, and 1820 is just included in that, and everything that you deal with practically is 1820 and thereafter. We in East London are a little bit further away, and we are 1820 enthusiasts. On behalf of all the people here who've had a very interesting hour on a subject which is really could not have been put